First of all, Gov, it's a pleasure to have you once again. What is Synergeia in the first place?
Synergeia is a non-profit foundation with a singular focus on education reform. Okay? And this comes from studies that show that the Philippine public education system is failing.
Failing.
Some of the indicators, for example, the PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, among 79 countries throughout the world, Filipino pupils are ranked at the bottom in terms of command of English, arithmetic, and science. Okay? In English, I think we're at the bottom. Last, in arithmetic, I think we're second to the last. Okay? And this is not just 1 year. Previous studies have shown the same results. Okay? The other disturbing data tells us that Filipino students have the lowest IQ, average IQ, in Southeast Asia. Okay? Our average IQ, based on the most recent test, I think is about 86.
86.
86 Filipino pupils. The highest, I think, is Singapore with an average IQ of 106, I think. No? We're doing worse than Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand. No, we're last. No? And then, the high incidence of malnutrition. Okay? As you probably know, critical stage for children, the mental and physical development in the first 1,000 days. If a child is not properly nourished in the first 1,000 days, the damage is permanent. Kuwan na siya, a child will end up, what's the term? Kuwan na severely delayed ang intellectual, emotional, kag physical development.
Stunted.
Stunted, yeah, that's the word. Stunted. So you're seeing a large proportion of the population of Filipino children who are stunted, permanently damaged in terms of development. No? And this explains partly why we have low IQ and why the results of the PISA tests are so bad. No? And ginlantaw ini sang Synergeia initially by our president, Dr. Miluida Guevara, former Undersecretary of Finance, no? But a teacher by profession as well. The basic problem is the system itself, the public education system. It's a long story, no? But essentially, what Synergeia has set out to do is to make the system work better by, among others, getting the local governments and local communities more involved in educating children.
But that is a very complex and giant task.
Precisely. The system actually almost prevents the engagement of local governments and local communities in the job of educating children, okay, in the public education system. Why? Because the Department of Education is a monolith that is very, what's the term again? Hierarchical. All the decisions are made at the top. There's very little autonomy at the school level. And syempre, all your curriculum, all the major decisions are made at the top. The local schools just implement whatever the top says.
And that is interesting. Let me butt in for a while ago, because with the local government code, we have devolved a lot of functions sa LGUs.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. Some would even saying we have even democratized corruption down to the local level. But what you're saying now,
yes, but not education.
here we have a situation, education, ang LGUs cannot do anything about it.
Yes, because education was not devolved to local governments. Okay. But the funny thing is, you have a local school board. Okay? Traditionally, local school boards, which are co-chaired by the local chief executive, the mayor, or the governor, in the case of a provincial school board, and the division superintendent or the supervisor. So co-chaired na, no? And I don't know if you know this. We have a special education fund,
Yeah.
the SEF.
20%.
No. Half of your real property taxes
Goes to that.
on the average is for the SEF. You know, there's 1% real property tax and then 1% SEF, Special Education Fund. That is the only budget that is not within the scope of authority of the Sanggunian. It is only the local school board that passes on the budget. Okay? Meaning, for example, in the case of the province, the provincial school board would have, let's say, a special education fund for the year, let's say in the amount of 100 million. Okay? The budget for the special education fund or the local school board is passed by the local school board, not the Sanggunian. Okay?
And the local school board is headed by the mayor.
Co-chaired
Co-chaired.
by the mayor and the provincial division superintendent, or in the case of cities, the local superintendent. Okay. How is the special education fund allocated? Pagsugod sa Synergeia, we studied the special education fund, and at that time we were talking about 7 billion pesos. Among all the local governments, special education fund purely for education, supposed to be. How was it allocated? A lot of it would be spent for sports and culture. So palaro. Okay? In fact, I'm guilty of that as well. No, when I was in the capital, about 30% of my special education fund was allocated for sports and culture. Essentially, ang palaro, support for the palaro. From district level to provincial level, all the way up to national, regional, national. The rest would be used for many things. Teachers, additional teachers, classrooms, school furniture, books, many things, bilang so many requests from so many local school boards, you try to give a little to everybody. In short, a lot of the special education fund went to things that had no real long-term impact on the quality of education. Kanugon, in other words. Because there was really no focus. The feeling of the local school boards was, well, this is money that's here for us. We can spend it to meet the needs of the teachers, the schools, the parents, etc. Synergeia has tried to instill this attitude that everything we do in the local school board should be focused on improving the performance of pupils. In other words, anything you want to spend, you ask the question, will this contribute to the education of our children?
And then you pointed out a while ago ang malnutrition has a, how should you call it? Correlational
Yeah.
relationship
Sa performance of pupils.
sa performance sa ilang IQ
Yeah.
or overall mental performance. But that is not part of what is being spent for.
No. Well, sometimes may ara, no, you support a feeding program. In fact, we did sa province ng Chimpoco. We had feeding programs for malnourished. It's a regular program of local governments, no. But when you look at the overall, masiling ka nga kulang pa because there is still a high incidence of malnutrition, severe or otherwise, no. Now, so we ask ourselves, how do you improve the investments that you put on public education? So the basic approach or strategy of Synergeia was get the stakeholders working together using that common slogan, it takes a village to raise a child or to educate a child. Meaning, this is not just the problem of DepEd. All the other stakeholders, the local governments, the school governing council, which is another thing we can take up, the parents, the parent teachers associations, and of course, the pupils themselves. No? So you look for a way to make all of this come together with one thought in mind. Everything we do must contribute to improving the performance of children in school. So our mission over the last, how many years? 14, 15 years, has been to make education work by bringing the local school board together with DepEd and together with the local communities by empowering and enabling the school governing councils. The school governing councils are the equivalent of the local school board at the provincial or city level. But ang school governing level is at the level of the school. Okay, so ara dira ang principal or school head, and then ara ang PTA and other stakeholders. What we've been doing over the last many years is providing a venue for school governing councils to know what they are supposed to be for, to find ways to empower them, and to reorient the local school board and the school governing council stakeholders about what it is we ought to be doing for the children. No? So, ang mga ginabuhat subong is we're addressing the lack of teachers or the lack of skills of teachers. So, damo ni nga training ang ginahatag, for example, ni Nene Guevara for teachers mismo. Ang parents, for example, one problem ang readership, ang reading ability. Kadamo, this is sad to report, but there are still many pupils who do not even know how to read, even if they've reached grade 6. Okay? Why is that? How can you pass a pupil if he or she doesn't know how to read? The answer is simple. You cannot fail pupils in the public school system.
And I will go to that later on, no? Because until now, ang metric na ginagamit sa DepEd is cohort survival ratio.
Siyempre.
As long as naka-move ka forward, that is good.
Yes.
But let's go deeper into that later on, no?
Well, just very briefly, why can you not fail them? Because if you do, you would fail a high number of pupils and you would clog up the system.
The newsrooms, the classrooms.
In other words, you need to keep moving them up kaya may masulod ng bago eh. If you fail a significant percentage, for example, butang mo 30%, maklag up ang system. Diri sa dalom. No? So you keep graduating or passing them on to the next higher grade.
Total,
Or,
maalam man na sila kay may YouTube na kag Facebook.
or some of them drop out eventually. Mahuya na magsulod sa high school, for example, kaya hindi ka balo magbasa. So we have a reading program. Okay? We look for ways to enable pupils to read and comprehend. Ang problema, we also found out, many pupils could read words, but they didn't understand the words. Nga, na-memorize nilang itsura sang word. Ang cat, ang CAT, no? Memorize nilang itsura. But if you don't correlate that with the picture, for example, sila in other words, kung hatagan mo na sang complex sentences, they might know how to pronounce the word, pero hindi nila ma-comprehend the whole sentence.
Oh my.
That's why kanubo sang performance, no? So reading programs, enabling teachers to teach better, providing materials, no? Workbooks, etc. Do you know that there is no budget for workbooks for individual pupils?
Wala budget?
Wala. There's no budget of DepEd for workbooks that you can bring home and work on by yourself. Wala. No? It's worse now because kuha na kita subong.
Modules.
Modules, etc. So, ang local government unit since last year, pagka-lockdown, have spent huge amounts of money to produce modules. Okay? Now, ang problema is, first you design the modules, which Synergeia has been engaged in, then you produce the modules, then you make sure they're distributed on time, and then, the most important, you make sure that the modules are used by the pupils. Paano karon kung illiterate ang parents?
Exactly.
Okay? So, another problem came out. What do you do with illiterate or subliterate parents? So, hatagan mo man na isang special interventions to improve the reading skills, for example.
But these are things that government is supposed to do.
Supposed to do, no? But kung lang taon mo, I mean, in fairness to DepEd, you have a huge problem.
Huge indeed.
DepEd is a huge department. Okay? And mabudlayan ka, bisan sinong ibutang mo sa babaw as Secretary of Education, kung hindi eksaktong iya nga thinking nga the solution is didto sa dalom, no? You establish policy, direction, let's say curriculum, etc., no? Didto sa babaw, but you make sure that everything is implemented properly. There is dalom.
I don't want to sound ageist.
Hierarchical sang DepEd eh.
I don't want to sound ageist, pero ang problem is, most of the secretaries are either not products of the public school system itself. And most of those nga nag-secretary, medyo may avanse ng edad. I mean,
Especially now, no?
especially now.
Well, maybe could be one of the reasons, no? A lack of understanding of what's going on there is dalom. Yeah, it would be nice to see, for example, somebody who rose from the ranks, who became head teacher, principal, then district supervisor, nag-superintendent, nag-USEC, etc., and then become secretary. Because kabalo siya sang problema, halin sa dalom. For example, teachers. We've asked many times, why is the quality of teachers so bad? Okay? It's not pleasant talking about this, but it's the truth. There are so many teachers who get employed, well, first who get educated by
Substandard.
substandard schools.
Well, let's say para social, subpar.
Okay? They graduate and they look for a job sa DepEd. How do they get their jobs? I mean, we hear this all the time. By admission of the teachers themselves, they pay for their jobs, for their position.
Or maninoy nilang mayor.
Yeah, well, among others, maninoy ang mayor, ang congressman, etc., no? But many times, and we've heard this from themselves, they have to pay for their position. The amounts can be
Amo na
staggering.
ka-entrenched ang corruption sa DepEd.
So,
Okay, now let's talk about that a bit.
Oh.
When you say for you to be promoted, well, I've heard a lot of complaints. For example, teacher 1 ka for 8 years, wala ka gasaka, kumpleto ka na masteral. But then again, it's still a patronage-based ranking system.
In many cases,
In many cases. Pilang bayaran nila at the minimum?
I've heard some teachers say they paid 300, 500,000 to get a position.
To get a position.
Then ang ilan lang lantaw, well, I can pay for this with my salary. Because salaries of teachers have really increased dramatically, di ba? So they'll say, I can pay for this in 2 years. At least may permanent job na ko. Di ba? So, yeah, there's a lot to be desired, no, as far as quality of teachers is concerned. But again, in fairness, there are so many good teachers also, and unfortunately, many of them don't get the right recognition.
Although I have to qualify, in the past, or even until now, sa mga bukid-bukid, magambal ka, ano ka, maestro, it still has a certain dignified ring to it, di ba? Ang teaching is a noble job mo. My wife is a teacher. Ang amon nga TV unit director is also a teacher. And my sister is actually a teacher also. And I know that it actually requires more than the 8 to 5 nga oras.
Oh, definitely. Of course, yes. In fact, being a public school teacher is a big sacrifice kung lang taon mo. Grabe ang challenges nga ginatubang sa public school teacher. Okay. So in many cases, public school teachers are heroes. No, let's not be quiet about that. No, there are so many unsung heroes in the public school system. Okay, dako nga sacrifice. But again, going back to what you said. Teaching is a noble profession. And when you say that you're a teacher, you're supposed to say it with pride. But we've also heard, especially in the rural areas, people saying, ini siya nag-teacher na lang, kay wala na sa ibang masarangan.
Lang.
Oo, nag-teacher na lang. Or a parent will, for example, say to may 3 kabataan or 4, ang masarangan niya isa lang, nga mapa-college. So, sing ano niya, tuto, diri ka na lang bilin sa uma, no? Ikaw yaday, hulat ka na lang anay, kay tanon ta, kung makasarang na ta, basi makatapos ka sa imo high school. Ikaw inday, teacher ka na lang. Ikaw lang anay, ang gastuhan namon, teacher ka na lang, kay para nga dasig, dayon kung makakuha ka obra mo, may ara kita sa inog sagod, pamilya. The essence of teaching as a noble profession, kung isaan nagkakadula na ito.
And that is true because even teachers I've met and talked to, naghambal nga ang impresyon sang tao sa maestra, palautang. That's number 1.
Yeah.
Palautang, yan mo gina. Well, I really don't know. But then again, ang imo ginhambal kay ina are challenges so complex nga hindi iba may ara ko na istorya nga teacher sang una sa Alangilan. Ang estudyante halin pa sa kanlandog. Muro siya. Ginalakat pakadto pakari sa eskwelahan.
Yeah.
One day ang iya nga isa ka estudyante nang gilibi on lunch time. Tikin pamangkot siya anong tabo? Siya dula sudan ko. Siya nanong sudan mo haw? Siya rin mo wala na ho. Siya anong sudan mo siya asin. Di kay init pang kanon pagbutang sang asin tingod natural matunaw.
Yeah.
And so what the teacher did was ginbaklan niya sudan, and this occurs on an almost daily basis. May isa man ka teacher nga naistorya ko, siya ga bakal sang tubig sa water dispenser because iban nga estudyante hindi na magkaon, mainom na lang tubig. And that
Correct.
is,
Yeah.
I mean, I've been listening to you for the past several minutes and medyo bugat, no? I
Bugat.
mean, that is how bad the system is.
And ang sense namong is people don't like to talk about it. Kay,
Worse, do they even care about it?
well, worse, no? So, ang pamangkot sa Synergeia really is, how do you solve this huge problem? So, ang approach naman really has been, work with the local governments and the local communities. Local school board, kag school governing councils. Okay? Make everybody aware nga ang edukasyon sang kabataan hindi lang responsibilidad sang DepEd. It takes a whole village to educate a child. So, the results are dramatic. We've worked with Valenzuela, for example, city, with the Gatchalians. No? Si Mayor Rex Gatchalian is a model in education governance. Magambal si Mayor Rex, daw Secretary of Education. Okay? And we've worked with many local government units. No? And makita mo ang year to year ang resulta. Dramatic results in improvement in reading skills and performance ng kabataan. We've addressed as well ang problem of dropouts, okay? And illiteracy, no? Illiterate parents. So, makita mo nga ang away ari sa idalom. Dito sa ibabaw, we're trying to, for example, convince the DepEd to allow more autonomy sa eskwelahan. And to some extent, it's being done. No? Ginahatagan authorities ang principals, for example, to decide on how to spend their allocations. But damo pa areas nga kung tani ma-improve ang level of autonomy sa local schools. Because the closer you are to the problem, supposed to be the better you understand the solution and the more effectively you can implement ang mga solutions. But kung ang permi lang hambal sa imo sang teachers or sang school heads, well, we have to get clearance from the top, mahinay.